Hello, let's talk about the basics of the project procurement management, and I'll abbreviate that. You'll find that at times that your project will need assistance in the form of labor, resource, or other tools from outside vendors. The project procurement management knowledge area, there it is, and I'll also type in the knowledge area, which I like to abbreviate as KA, is designed to help you better protect your project, your company, and funnily enough, your partner or your vendor that you'll use in the procurement process. This tutorial covers the planned procurement planning process, as you can see right there, in the project procurement management knowledge area. Boy, that's a lot of big words. One note about these processes is that they sometimes overlap and aren't as distinct from each other as you might expect. Now, how do these processes relate? During the planned procurement process, if you decide not to procure products or services, then schedule the work for your own teams. Otherwise, you should follow the other processes outlined in this knowledge area. And the first group are those we're going to discuss. The other three processes we're not going to discuss in this short tutorial. They include conduct procurements, administrate the procurements, and then close the procurements. Let's define what procurement planning is by first outlining the roles. There's always a buyer. Since we're talking to you as a project manager or a scrum master, this is probably more in keeping to what your role will be. And then there's the seller or sellers. These are the organizations that will be selected to provide the product or services. In fact, the previous workflow diagram showed the procurement process from the buyer's perspective. So what connects the buyer and the seller? Well, I'm glad you asked. And it's, of course, the contract, the big C. This is a legal document that represents a mutually binding agreement. And we're going to show some of the highlights of this on a legal pad. Well, I thought that was funny. All right. So what are some of the characteristics of a contract? Okay, for one, it's a legal document. It also obligates both the seller to provide the specified product or service and obligates the buyer to provide the agreed upon payment or terms. What else? A schedule is always one of those for delivery and quality according to expectations. There must be an adherence to policies and procedures. There's also authority in terms of who declares who is able to sign for both parties. And in case of a dispute, heaven forbid you have one of those, but if you do, you need to provide enough clarity and definition for subsequent resolution. If it's too ambiguous, both parties might suffer. And if it's too punishing, you probably aren't going to have a win-win result. You also have terms and conditions. We'll call that T's and C's that involve the life cycle and payment schedules. And here's an example. Royalty payments will be expected at $1 per copy for the software for a period of 5 years following delivery. And finally, no oral agreement or no verbal. This is where an agreement is written and approved by both parties before work commences. A handshake agreement is setting both parties up for a big letdown, and commencing work before the agreement has been signed will more than likely put the seller at risk just in case business terms collapse, or another competitive seller, in other words, the buyer's owner's son-in-law's business, comes into play. And let's show that graphically. Here comes the new seller. Now, I think that's a very good representation of what might happen. No wonder that guy's so happy. You know, most procurement activities must answer the age-old make versus buy decision. It's important that you make the right decision that ultimately benefits the customer, the buyer, meaning you, and of course the seller. Okay, let's go through what's involved with the procurement process. At the start, you would want to identify the sellers. Usually there's more than one. The buyer releases the statement of work and possibly a purchase order to the sellers. The sellers respond. The buyer selects the seller. You start the work. The cycle commences with the seller issuing invoices and the buyer releasing payments or whatever other terms you have agreed to until the work is completed. Finally, the procurement process is closed. The statement of work most commonly uses the acronym SOW. At this point, there's usually a maintenance or warranty period, but for all intents and purposes, the work has been completed. The scope baseline defines the work and generally has the following three components: the project scope statement, the WBS, which is the work breakdown structure, and the associated WBS dictionary. Next, the Stakeholder Requirements documentation can be used. Why in the world would you use something like that? Probably the best answer is to use a simple example. You'll need to make sure that incorporating a third party's products or services won't have an impact to the end user customer licensing obligations. This gets more and more confusing when applications incorporate technology that adheres to open source licensing, gaining popularity with Android and Linux applications. There are really two tools and techniques used in this process. The first is the make versus buy analysis that we mentioned earlier. This includes analyzing tried and true criteria, including skill, capacity of the seller, cost, and risk. Those four together probably form the best criteria that you can use to decide whether to make versus buy. And one by itself, like cost, can easily lead to regretful decisions. You can simplify the whole make versus buy decision by using a very simple form of risk-reward decision matrix. Finally, as far as techniques, expert judgment is simply where the experience and judgment with key stakeholders and plain old gut feeling are usually the best technique in planning for procurement. Typical procurement processes, as well as the PMBOK guide, have many outputs in this, but we're going to focus on three of the key ones. The first is the Procurement Management Plan. This provides guidance for procurements as contracts, standard terms used, and if the procurement is shared with other projects. That is especially important for software companies, where some technology may be used on more than one product line. Also includes rules for handling suppliers, constraints, assumptions, and schedules. The procurement statement of work summarizes a description with enough detail to ensure that the seller has the skills to do the work, along with whatever information is necessary for the seller to reply to your proposal. One item that can be missed, especially on software and IT projects, is where you're unclear on who actually performs the quality assurance, the QA, for final acceptance. As you can see, this is a pretty important document. Don't be surprised if you're leading an agile project that the procurement statement of work will probably be adjusted along the way. Finally, there's the procurement document package and source selection to make sure that every potential seller gets the same fair treatment and that the selection criteria as to who the winner will be chosen is absolutely clear. Before you go out for a competitive bid, follow your company's procurement best practices. If it isn't in the plan or the contract, then it must not be a requirement. Last but not least, make the procurement clear and a win-win for both the buyer and the seller. All of these factors play together to have a successful project procurement plan. So now you know.